Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 32 of Life Lessons and Combat Sports. I'm your host, Eric Hamidi. Thank you for joining me. I'm here with another edition of MMA, a month-long full of mixed martial arts themed episodes. So it's exciting to get into the next subject matter. And to be honest, this is kind of exciting to me because this is an individual who I've never talked about before on the podcast. So it'll be kind of cool to get into the story of this individual and just really dissect it and just really kind of venture into a new area that I've never really done before. And I think it's noteworthy because one, it is one of the most prolific fighters in the history of mixed martial arts. So I think this is an individual who, just his accomplishments and his credentials, they speak for themselves. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at, is the fact that he is one of, if not the greatest mixed martial artist in the history of the sport. In my opinion, he's somebody who's in the top 5, at worst, top 10 all time. So I'll be excited to talk about him. And furthermore, another reason why I'm excited to talk about him is because I think something that happens in his career once he goes into the UFC is an important lesson for everybody to keep in mind. And to be honest, I think it's a good message to try to get across to everybody. So I'm not really gonna do too long of an intro. I just want to get right into it. The individual that I'm talking about for today's episode is Anderson Silva, former UFC Middleweight champion. Like I said, one of the best to ever do it. And just what's interesting about Anderson Silva is the fact that this is an individual who really lives on in the lore of mixed martial arts, or just he's just like this legendary figure and just like one of the individuals that everybody talks about as far as being this great mixed martial artist, and just is a legend in the sport, and it's kind of like the gold standard when it comes to not only the skill of the sport and what it takes to be a skilled fighter, but also someone who carried himself with a lot of class. It's kind of interesting because he kind of is in the same vein as George St. Pierre as far as being this really skilled, respectful individual who just accomplished a lot in his sport. And it's kind of interesting that those two are kind of like neck and neck as far as that era of mixed martial arts where it was just rising in popularity, and these guys were like almost the faces of the sport. It's really just those two, and just like I have a soft spot for those individuals because they were at the top of the game when I started watching mixed martial arts. So it's kind of like why I always have a little bit of a attachment to those individuals. And I've done an episode talking about GSP, but now I'm going into Anderson Silva. The way he started out was that he was growing up in Brazil, and he lived with his aunt and uncle, and his family, they didn't really have a lot of money, and Anderson comes from hard times. I mean, they came from such a, money was so tight with them that Anderson Silva couldn't even take formalized martial arts classes. The way he started in it was that there were kids in his neighborhood that did Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but because he couldn't afford classes himself, he would basically watch the kids do their techniques and drill. He would watch them train, do their techniques and drill, and then he would take what he saw and try to implement that when he sparred with them. So in lieu of classes, that's what he did, and just in his words, doing that was better than no training whatsoever. So that was kind of like Anderson's humble beginnings with martial arts. But then eventually his family was able to gather up enough money for him to actually take formalized classes. So he started taking Taekwondo classes at age 12, but then eventually later on he moved on to capoeira before finally settling on Muay Thai at age 16, which, to be honest, his striking prowess and his Muay Thai skills are the thing that Anderson Silva would become most well known for. So it's kind of interesting that he landed on that, and just like, that's really where his strong suit would land. And I guess I say that considering that of Anderson Silva's 34 victories in mixed martial arts, only 3 of them have come by way of submission. I guess when you really think about it though, considering his background, he really had all the tools in place to be a skilled mixed martial artist because he had the Brazilian jiu-jitsu down and then he had the striking down. So, those are the two elements that you absolutely need. I mean, really the only thing that was kind of missing in his game was like a strong wrestling background. But, nonetheless, as you'll discover a little bit later on, that never stopped Anderson from achieving success. One little disclaimer that I want to give real quick is that there's some work going on in my neighborhood, like with a wood chipper and stuff like that, so there may be some noise issues about that. I apologize for that. Hopefully it doesn't come across too much in the recording. But anyway, to get back on track, so Anderson Silva, he has that background in martial arts as a child, and then eventually he starts competing in mixed martial arts. He makes his debut in 1997. From there, he's competing in both Brazil and Japan. So these are his humble beginnings as far as him as an athlete. And just what's also kind of interesting about Anderson Silva is that he did, and even now still does, occasionally compete in some boxing matches. I mean, I'm not going to focus too much on that in this particular episode. I'm just going to focus on his mixed martial arts career. It's just that he would kind of bounce around between the two and just like really have almost like a prolific martial arts career when you really think about it. And just, we'll get into that. I'll just give a little note about that a little bit later. But yeah, he's competing in both Brazil and Japan in the early years of his career. I guess one of the things that Anderson Silva accomplished, like one of his biggest victories early in his career came when he defeated this one Japanese mixed martial artist, Hayato Sakurai. I know he's not an uber famous MMA fighter like a Brock Lesnar or Conor McGregor or anything like that, but for people who are fans of the sport, they know who Hayato Sakurai is and they just know how accomplished he was. At the time, he was undefeated at 18 wins, 0 losses, and 2 draws. So that was a big deal when Anderson actually defeated him. He won the Judo Middleweight Championship at that time, and just, yeah, that was a big moment and just really one of those like hallmarks for Anderson's career at the time. And like I kind of have already alluded to, is that Anderson, he was bouncing around between Brazil and Japan, and he actually ended up fighting for Pride Fighting Championship, which, if y'all remember from my Kevin Randleman episode, I believe I mentioned it in there, where Pride was basically this Japanese mixed martial arts organization. I actually have the poster of it right over there, so it's another piece I've added to the backdrop there. But Pride was a Japanese organization. It started in 1997, and just they were known for having these grand spectacles and just having this big show presentation and all that stuff. It was almost like they took all the elements from professional wrestling and combined into MMA with their entrances and their, set designs or their stages and all that stuff. But I mean, they also put on fantastic fights and were known for having really skilled fighters at the time. And just like, we're so used to the UFC being the #1 mixed martial arts organization, but there was a period of time where Pride was in fact #1, and just like they had a really solid roster of fighters, like guys like Fedor Emelianenko, Mirko Cro Cop, Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, Vanderlei Silva, just Dan Henderson, who I'll touch on a little bit later. Just like all these different people that, so many names that I don't have time to get into all of them. But he fought a few times for that organization. He went 3-2, 3 wins, 2 losses in the organization. And it's something that, it's kind of interesting seeing that Anderson Silva actually competed in that organization, considering that, he's one of the few fighters to fight for both UFC and Pride, but he's more well known for his UFC career. And I guess given that, we can say that Anderson is actually one of, if not the best fighters to ever come from Pride over into the UFC. And the reason why I'm saying that is because Pride lasted until 2007, when Zuffa, which was the parent company, bought Pride. And when that happened, a lot of guys who were in that organization transitioned over into the UFC. But the thing is that for one reason or another, a lot of those guys didn't really do too well, and just it was reasons like they were transitioning from competing in a traditional four-sided ring into an eight-sided octagon, so their sense of ring or cage awareness kind of had to change, or just like they were going there later on in their career, so their bodies were like breaking down at the time, so they couldn't compete at that high level anymore. But really, Anderson Silva is one of the individuals who did by far the best, at the very least one of the best, when he transitioned over there, which I guess is kind of connected to the life lesson that I'll talk about a little bit later on. But yeah, he competed in Pride, and there were a couple fights there that I think people remember the most. One of them was a win that he had when he defeated Carlos Newton, who was a former UFC welterweight champion. He defeated him by flying knee, and that was in March of 2003. That's one of the fights that he's most well known for. And then probably the other most famous fight of his in Pride, unfortunately, he was on the losing end of that one, and it's just one of the more unique submissions that you'll see, where basically Anderson Silva, he's fighting this guy named Ryo Chonen, and he loses that fight by a flying scissor heel hook. It just, I mean, it's definitely a submission that you're not gonna see all too often, and it's like definitely when you think about crazy moments in MMA or just like the craziest submissions, that's definitely up there. Just, you know, it's crazy to think what Anderson Silva would, like seeing what Anderson Silva would become, and looking back on that and seeing, oh, you lost to this, fighter, you lost to Ryo Chonen by flying scissor heel hook. I mean, that's just really random. And I guess this would be a good time to mention this part of his story, that at the time, well, okay, up until about mid 2003 or 2004, Anderson Silva, he was training with this one MMA gym, this one martial arts gym called Chuta Box, which is a Brazilian martial arts gym that was really known for their Muay Thai, and they had individuals like Vanderlei Silva, who was a former Pride middleweight champion. They had Mauricio Shogun Rua, who was a former UFC light heavyweight champion. Those are probably two of the most famous individuals to come out of that camp. He was training with them for the longest time, but then either in mid 2003 or early part of 2004, he switches camps. He goes from Chuta Box to this other camp called Brazilian Top Team. And, it's kind of interesting when you look at the story of, the story of both Brazilian Top Team and Chuta Box, because they had a really intense rivalry with each other. I mean, some of the individuals that Brazilian Top Team had were Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, who was a former Pride middleweight champ. Sorry, no, I'm getting all the weight classes wrong today. Sorry, he was the former Pride heavyweight champion. And then you also had his twin brother, Antonio Rogerio Nogueira, who was a very strong competitor in Pride himself. You had guys like Ricardo Arona. You had guys like Murilo Bustamante, who was a former UFC middleweight champion. See, I got that weight class right. Which, just on a quick side note, in case anyone who's not aware, because we are going to talk about this later, middleweight has a weight limit of 185 pounds, and that's where Anderson would eventually win his championship in that organization. So he switches over to that camp, and it's kind of interesting that it's almost like the shift in his career happened when he switched camps. I mean, like, there may be a multitude of reasons as far as why that happened. I mean, there are certain reasons that Anderson did switch camps. Like, he wanted to hone his ground game, which he was going to be in good hands with the Nogueira brothers, who were just very well known for their jiu-jitsu. I know that was one of the goals that he had going to Brazilian Top Team. But to be honest, when you look at the shift that happened in Anderson Silva's career from 2005 onwards, I don't know if necessarily that's the only reason. I mean, it may have just been a thing where, okay, he was finally starting to find his groove as a fighter and he was finally starting to improve his skills and get better and all that stuff. So maybe that's why the shift happened. Or it could have been that just Brazilian Top Team was a better fit for him and just fulfilled his needs better than Box did. I mean, I don't really know. It's an interesting timing of things, I would say. And the only reason I'm bringing that up is because I think if my research is correct and he did go to Brazilian Top Team in the latter part of 2003, then when he made that switch, his record from that moment on, up until the time he lost the UFC Middleweight Championship, he went 22 wins and 2 losses. I guess here's the thesis. I'm not saying that's definitively how things changed for him, but it could have been. So that fight with Ryo Chonan, that happened in December of 2004. That was his last fight for Pride. From that moment on, he's competing in a few different organizations, and then eventually he lands in the UFC in June of 2006. So when he came into the organization, he was on a 1-fight win streak. He had lost a bout in January of 2006 due to controversial circumstances. That's, part of that whole 22-2 run I was just talking about. He debuts in the UFC and he basically just demolishes his opponent, Chris Lieben. I remember watching that fight and I thought to myself, this is an individual that I need to pay attention to. It was one of those moments where I'm watching combat sports where I see a guy perform, I'm so impressed with them, and I make it a point to remember that person moving forward. And I did that with him. I was like, oh wow, this guy's so great. And then I see the graphic with his name, like Anderson Silva. I'm like, I gotta remember that. Anderson Silva, Anderson Silva, Anderson Silva. I think the thing that kind of helped was the fact that his first name was Anderson, where, up until that point, anytime I heard the name Anderson, it was somebody's last name, so maybe that helped me remember. I remember the other person from that card where I thought that about them was Rashad Evans, who also competed on there. He has that debut, and then a few months later, he ends up getting a UFC middleweight title shot against then defending champion Rich Franklin. I made a note in my episode last year on Rich Franklin, just talking about his credentials and just how he was a former middleweight champion and he was just the guy there. And then what ends up happening is that Anderson Silva just demolishes Rich Franklin. It just puts on this stellar performance, this brutal display of Muay Thai that just really signaled the passing of a torch, or just a new king claiming the throne, and just this was the guy at middleweight at this point. So that was a very impressive performance, and that just kicked off this era of title defense after title defense, win after win, and just all this other stuff, the thing that we came to know Anderson Silva by. Because from that moment on, he would go on to defend the middleweight title 10 times, which was a record for its time that only got beat in 2017 when UFC flyweight champion Demetrius Johnson defended his title 11 times. So even with that, just one title defense breaks Anderson's record. It wasn't just the fact that Anderson was winning and defending his title, it was the way that he was doing it, where he was just putting on all these impressive performances after impressive performances. And just this is the way that I described Anderson Silva, was the fact that he did things that you would only see in Dragon Ball Z. A year later, he's in a rematch with Rich Franklin, where there's a moment in that fight where Rich is throwing punches at him and Anderson is dodging, ducking, weaving, all this other stuff. It was just things that you had never seen in an actual fight before. There was another instance in August of 2009 when he went up against Forrest Griffin, where he just did the same exact thing and just in an even more impressive way than he did in the Rich Franklin fight. And that was just amazing to see because it was just almost like it was faster and just like, even more dominant. I mean, like when I say doing stuff that you would see in Dragon Ball Z, what I mean by that is that like if you're watching Vegeta fight Frieza and then, Frieza's just dodging all these punches, that's exactly what Anderson was doing in those fights. Among many other impressive performances that he had, it's just like he was so unique and he was so stylish and so, fluid in his movement and all that stuff. It was just amazing to see, and just like I think that's what helps make him such a legendary figure within MMA. So, I mean, there's so many moments that you could pick out of Anderson's career. I mean, like, there's those moments that I just mentioned. There's the fact that he unified the UFC and Pride titles by defeating Dan Henderson in March of 2008. I mean, just like, Dan Henderson was no slouch whatsoever. So that was a big deal when he won that fight. Or just like the fact that he came in with an injury against Rich Franklin and just won from the brink of defeat, even though he had lost every round going into the fifth and final round. He ended up winning by submission. It was like that thing where you're just like, you couldn't beat Anderson Silva on his worst day even. Or the fact that he had the first front kick KO in the UFC when he defeated Vitor Belfort to defend his title in February of 2011. I mean, that's a highlight reel moment that's so often used in all these hype packages for the UFC, or just like that image of Anderson's foot landing on Vitor Belfort's face. Just that image lives in the minds of MMA fans, just, everywhere. And it's just like, it will, for many years to come. And just, it was really special to see him compete. And it was really special to watch him perform and just see this legend grow and just really be this guy who was like this unstoppable force. But, all things come to an end eventually, and for Anderson Silva, that came in July of 2013 when he faced off against Chris Weidman, who, going into that bout, I remember a lot of people were thinking, oh, Chris might actually have a chance. I mean, it was one of those things where, like, you kind of felt like Anderson still could win, but, you weren't exactly sure. You just kind of thought, like, okay, this isn't just a, this isn't just a given that Anderson's going to win. Chris might actually do it. And he did end up winning. So Chris Weidman, he shocks the world and ends this 6.5-year title reign that Anderson Silva had to become the new UFC middleweight champion. And just like that in and of itself is a moment that's going to live on forever in MMA, just like the unseating of the dominant king. I mean, like, I don't really know what other verbiage I can use for that. Given the fact that Anderson Silva defended his title 10 times, of course they did an immediate rematch, and that happened in December of 2013, where unfortunately for him, he ended up suffering a horrific leg injury that just really, I mean, like, Anderson was never the same after that bout. I mean, it was kind of one of those things where he had several fights after that, but that kind of amazing performance and all that stuff that you saw, you never really saw that again. And I think it's safe to say that when he had that leg injury where he literally broke his leg in half, he was never the same after that. So that put him out of competition for about a year, and he comes back in January of 2015. But like I said, it just wasn't it wasn't the same. You didn't get the same kind of performances and all that stuff. And just like he would compete in MMA for quite a while after that, but during that entire time, he only won one fight. Unfortunately, every other fight he had was a loss, except for that return bout in January of 2015 against Nick Diaz, where originally that was a win for Anderson, but because he tested positive for banned substances, they ended up overturning it to a no contest. Even with that one win that he had during that time frame, it was very controversial. So he's competing in the UFC, but then eventually he had his last bout in October of 2020. And just after that, he was, he left the promotion and then would go on to compete in boxing where, he's done pretty well for himself, I would say. It's almost like he's found a new life as a boxer and just kind of like what had once been like, oh, something that he only occasionally done earlier in his career. Now he's like, that's his home and all that stuff. So unfortunately, his MMA career didn't end on the best of terms. He left the sport with a record of 34 wins, 11 losses, and 1 no contest. However, that rough stretch that he had post-championship doesn't take away from the things that Anderson achieved. It doesn't take away from the kind of reputation he has. And just, it's not great to see all those losses towards the end of his career. But at the same time, he didn't do, at least in my opinion, he didn't do so much damage to like the level of like a BJ Penn, for instance, where it just really tarnished his legacy. I think he's still, pretty well respected and he's still revered even despite that. And just like, it's really a testament to the things he was able to accomplish in his prime. The important message that I think is important to get across is the fact that I think what Anderson Silva's career shows us is that greatness can come later on in life. Now, if y'all remember if you've been following me for a while, you may remember I did some episodes on The Rock and Kane where this is kind of like a similar matter. I kind of feel like it touches on similar themes as far as, oh, well, it takes a while to figure out what works for you, or just like, it takes time to figure out what's your demographic, or just like what's your field that you'll excel in and all that stuff. I can sort of see the similarities, but I think I'm trying to take this a step further, or just kind of like instilling some, maybe some hope in yourself, or just like kind of like taking a next step as far as not just figuring out something, but you may actually end up being great at something and it'll come later in life. And I guess this is also connected to the fact that maybe sometimes people will think that because they haven't achieved a certain amount of success at a certain time, then that means it's not going to happen. But I think honestly, this is an example of showing that it can in fact come later in life. I want to throw some disclaimers in here where I'm not saying that, like whether or not you become really good or great at something, it all depends on the circumstances, the work, and the work that you're putting in. So like, I'm not saying that, oh, for sure, if you took up guitar playing tomorrow, then you're gonna become great in like 5 or 10 years time. Like maybe that doesn't happen, but I think what's important is that you at least have that possibility in your mind, or that you at least think or consider that could be an option. Like that's the important thing. That I feel like there's a lot of different tangents I'm going into right now, but like, these things just kind of come to me, and I just really want to make sure that I emphasize these things, is the fact that greatness can come later in life, but the thing is, like, you have to put in the work for it. And I think if you do in fact put the work into something to try to get better at it, then at the very least, you will in fact get better at something, and or there's a potential for you to become even better, like, great at it, and maybe even one of the best. The reason why I feel like Anderson Silva's career is a good demonstration of that is because if you look at Anderson Silva before he entered the UFC, he had a record of 17 wins and 4 losses, which I would say is a pretty good record. I mean, that's like an 80% win percentage. But it's not as good as what he ended up with before his title loss to Chris Weidman, where he ended, like, going into that bout, he had a 33-4 record, which is 89, which is an 89% win percentage. I mean, we're damn near close to 90. And it just, like, that had an amazing sort of, that kind of has an amazing look to that, where it's just like, oh, in the 40 times that you've competed nearly, you've only lost 4. That is more impressive, with all due respect, than a record of 17 wins and 4 losses. But the thing is that prior to his UFC debut, I mean, I'm not really sure how much people saw Anderson as, like, oh, this guy who's going to become this all-time great. And I think also, when you looked at some of the losses that Anderson had in his career at the time, I mean, maybe that sort of made you believe there was only a certain limit that Anderson had, where just like, okay, he's a really good fighter, but he's not going to become one of the all-time greats. I mean, I don't really know how we could have predicted that. I mean, like, I can't really give a whole lot of, like, insight into that, because I wasn't even following MMA at the time. I didn't even know it existed. This was 2 years before I became a fan, so I don't really know what the, forums or, like, the online fan base was saying at the time. So I guess to kind of add to that, the reason why there may have been a situation where you didn't know how great Anderson was going to be was because, like, there were some people that Anderson lost to in Pride that there is no way in hell 2009 Anderson Silva would have lost to them. So, I don't know. He put in and, like, kind of like, to go back to what I said earlier in the episode, maybe it was that switch in camps from shoot to box to Brazilian top team that was the key to him becoming a better mixed martial artist. But, I think whatever he did, whether it was just through circumstance of finding his way or just, like, changing things up in his training, he ended up becoming that all-time great that we would all come to know him by. And just, like, this is, this kind of ties in with something, just, like, generally speaking, to kind of bring home this whole idea of, like, okay, if you haven't reached success by a certain age, it's still possible. I mean, like, one of the examples I kind of think about, and I think it's good because it ties in with the entertainment world, is the fact that Samuel L. Jackson, he was a struggling actor up until 1994 when he finally got casted for Pulp Fiction. That was kind of like his major breakthrough role that kind of, like, got him into the mind of, like, everybody. We know him now as that all-time great actor and just, like, this guy who's been in so many movies, but there was a period of time where that wasn't the case. But he, had that role. He had that role in Pulp Fiction. The rest is history, and that happened when he was 46. So, I mean, I guess it would be kind of interesting to, see how many people may have, like, I'd be curious to try to find out, like, if there were people around him saying that, oh, he should try to, like, find a new line of work or something by the time he was in his 40s. And I guess for me, I kind of take that advice in the sense of, this podcast that I'm doing, I mean, it's not at that, like, really successful level yet, and just, like, I'm not saying this in the sense like, oh, I've attained greatness with this, because, this is really something that I just started a year and a half ago, basically. So it's still very early on, but I guess, like, the kind of way that I interpret these kinds of examples is the fact that this is a podcast that I've discovered later on in my life. Like I said, it was a year and a half ago that I started it. So it's not as if this is something that I started in my 20s and then I have, like, a decade or more under my belt. But, like, I guess the takeaway I have from an Anderson Silva or Samuel L. Jackson is the fact that even though this is something that I started later, it does have the potential, or I can still have the dream of it being something big and being something special, despite the fact that I started it when I did. Now, there's still a lot of work to be done. I'm not anywhere close to where I want to be for this podcast, but I think to have that possibility in mind is something that helps keep me going. I mean, I guess I'll say this. Even if this never becomes a huge podcast, it's still something that I'm going to do, but because I enjoy it. However, I think the important takeaways for me to have as far as like, okay, the greatness can come later, and to put in the work to develop and grow an audience and make my content better, that is something that can be a good source of motivation. And I think that's something that I'm gonna, keep in mind. And just like, in the grand scheme of things, we're still very early on in this process. So there's still a lot of, things that can be achieved or improved on. And just like, I guess in a weird way, now that I just kind of thought about it, that's sort of what happened with Anderson Silva, because he debuted in mixed martial arts in 1997, and then it was almost 10 years after he started where he would begin his legendary run that I've been talking about this entire episode. To me, that just shows, whether it's him or Samuel L. Jackson starting his acting career and being a struggling actor for years until he finally got his break, that's a good story to kind of keep in mind, and just sort of like, to not be deterred by limited or no success up to a given point. Now, anything can happen. There's no guarantee, but I think to not even try would be... I think that would be a mistake, to not even go for it. That's just kind of like how I'm taking it. I'm going to keep doing what I can, and I'm going to keep trucking along. That's the most important thing that you can take away from Anderson Silva's story. It's kind of interesting because I sort of feel like there was a lot of information or a lot of things that I didn't get a chance to say. It's just one of those things where it's like, I got to head out right now. So I'm going to leave it at this stuff for right now. And also, kind of like what I say in other episodes of mine, is the fact that I think there's a lot of different life lessons you can take from certain individuals. So given my sort of thoughts and approach to this subject matter, and the fact that it is Anderson Silva, one of the best to ever do it, this is not gonna be the last time I return to this particular person. So there'll be more stories to tell. For right now, that's all I'm able to give y'all. So I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this episode. As usual, let me know what you think about this episode in the comments section below, or I would love to hear what are some of your favorite Anderson Silva moments or fights of his. It'll be really interesting to hear. So feel free to share that as well. Be sure to like, share, subscribe to my videos. Be sure to follow me on my social media accounts. On Instagram, I'm Life and Combat Sports, and then on Twitter, I'm L Combat Sports. That takes care of another episode of MMA. I'll catch y'all on the next one. See ya.